Cadê o card?
Os gringos não vai vir?
Okay, so before I start, I have to confess I didn't have much time for this lecture, so some explanations are not stuck. So feel free to complain. Well, as always, if you have any better solution than mine, can feel free to share your solution with us. Okay, I'll start from B, which I think was the most solved problem. It actually was not, but it's an easier problem. And pineapple as well. So you have a bunch of stuffed letters that can be either an apple, pineapple, or a pen. And you could like glue two stuff together. It satisfies to one of two conditions. These are the basic structures that we have. And in order to merge two structures, you have to satisfy either one of these two conditions. One, both, either both structures are simple and exactly one of them is a pen or a pineapple, whatever. Or both structures are not simple and they have the same length, same size. So when you're given this problem, it's a string of A's and P's. And what you're asked is whether these structures could be built using only basic structures. So, well, since the only way to merge two non-basic structures is by merging two non-basic structures of the same size, we know that these structures must have come from the merging of these two structures, right? Same goes for these two parts. This structure must have come from these two structures glued together. Same for these two structures. Okay. So just by looking at this, you realize that a structure can only be built if the length of the structure is a power of 2. If it is not a power of 2, then you cannot split the string in this way, because it always has to split the string right in half. Okay. So this one is a certain condition for a string to be achievable. Now, the other condition is, well, you know that at first we had all these pairs of basic structures and you merge them all together. So the only thing you have to check now is whether all these pairs are actually valid. The rule for checking whether a structural length 2 is valid is that they must have exactly one pair. So for each pair, we have to check whether it is possible for it to contain exactly one pair. And the only case that is not possible is when we have two A's. There's no way to have a 10 if there's no B. In all other cases, you can say this is a pen, this is a pen, and this is a pen, this is a pineapple. So all their pairs are valid. So the only thing you have to check beyond checking whether this string has a length that is a power of 2 is whether these pairs are, none of these pairs are of this type. So very simple solution. You could also solve this by using dynamic programming, but I think this is overkill. You just have to do this stuff. All right. Problem E, brief parrot. So this problem we had n warriors. And horses, I talked about horses, so for me, they're just circles. For each warrior and each horse, you had a value assigned to it. Had a value 1, 2, 3, 4. Each 1, 2, 3, 4. And what you're asked is whether there exists a pair Wi Hj such that if you pair the rest of the warriors with the rest of the horses, there are no pair W L Hk such that the product of these two guys is greater than or equal to the product of the guy that I get. Okay, so you basically have to check whether this is possible or not. So, okay, to start, if you want to check whether such solution exists, then we only have to check whether there is a solution that uses the maximum value of Wi and maximum value of J. Because if such solution exists with the value of W or H that is less than maximum, then you can easily, by a swapping argument, show that a solution that uses the maximum W and the maximum H also exists. So you only have to check whether for this pair, you compare the other guys to the product of four and forces was less than the product of these two guys. So okay, you have one threshold. So the product of every other pair other than this one does not exceed the Ui times Hj. But you have to pair every other warrior. So you could do this in a greedy way. So first, let's order the remaining warriors in decreasing order of value. 1 divided to Wi and minus 1. Let's assume this is satisfied. Okay. This guy has to be paired with someone. Okay. And with some H something. But this product does not exceed, actually must be less than this product. So which force would you take? Again, by a greedy argument, you could always pick the force with largest value that does not exceed that value, that product of the Wi shape. So for each guy, you just find the force that has maximum value, it doesn't exceed that product. You do that for every warrior before not allowing the same force to be used twice. If you are able to pair each warrior to some force that is fine this condition, then the answer to the problem is yes. Otherwise, clearly there will be no answer. So the answer to the problem will be no. Alright. Because we know that if a solution exists with some other H, okay, you can just swap these two guys. The restriction will still be satisfied, so you could always assume that there is a solution that uses the force with maximum value for this guy that does not exist. So there's no solution with this configuration, there is no solution at all. Alright, so typical greedy problem. Let's do problem C first. Stick magnet. So This problem you were given a graph, and you had to count the number of subgraphs in this graph that are isomorphic to the following graph. There are a couple ways to approach this. You can solve this problem using dynamic programming, but I'm going to show you how to solve this using just some counting. Okay. So the thing to notice about this particular graph is that these two vertices are like the most important, right? They are the only vertices in this graph that have degree greater than 1. So we're going to use these two guys as pivots to my count. Okay. So let's call this guy U, this guy G. Actually, those are really word letter choices. And okay. So what we need to do is iterate through every possible choice of A, find all valid choices of B, and to do some counting to decide how many ways I can choose these two neighbors of B and these 3 neighbors of A. Okay. So we're iterating through every vertex of the graph, and we pick one vertex to be vertex A. Vertex B has to be a neighbor of A, right? So for each possible neighbor, you pick one B, and have these two guys defined. Now we have to choose the remaining neighbors of A and remaining neighbors of B. But you have to be careful here because this is not just a matter of multiplying the degree of A minus 1 with the degree of B minus 1. Right? This will be counting the number of ways to choose these 3 guys. Use the remaining neighbors. Same for this guy multiplying these 2. This is close to the correct answer, but it's actually not because A and B, they might have common neighbors in the real graph, the original graph. And you'll be counting here the cases where you pick the same common neighbor for both the neighbor of A and B. So this will be the same vertex, which cannot happen. So you have to fix this counting. And well, the first thing you could do is to count the number of common neighbors of A and B. Let's see, this number is QC. This is 1. So we know that QA has degree of A minus 1 minus QC neighbors that are not neighbors of B, and B has degree of B minus 1 minus QC neighbors, 3 neighbors that are not neighbors of A. Okay. And now we have some cases here. For both A and B, I can decide how many common neighbors I can use for both. And you just have to be careful not to consider the same neighbor for these 2 vertices at the same time. So for instance, if I decide to use 1 common neighbor for A and 2 common neighbors for A and 1 common neighbor for B, now I can do the normal counting, and I will get something like QA chooses 1 times QC chooses 2. This will be the number of ways to choose these 3 guys. Times Q. I'm going to call this QA. And this is QB. QB 1 times QC minus 2, because I already picked 2 common neighbors to be neighbors of A. Chooses 1. Right? Now I'm not double counting anything, I'm not counting any invalid choices. Now the thing is that I have actually 3 times 4 cases, because B can have between 0, B can use between 0 and 2 common neighbors, and A can use between 0 and 4 common neighbors. So you could look at this and think this will be very tedious to code because you have 12 cases to code. But you can calculate this just by using 2 methods of force, deciding for A and B how many common neighbors you want to use. So you do, so for each number of common neighbors you want to use for A, for each number of common neighbors you want to use for B, you calculate this value and add it to the result. Okay. So this was a pretty easy way to approach this problem. Okay. Was that clear? Let's do problem I. Prime. This problem involves a lot of primes. You're given 2 primes A and B. And you want to reach B from A, and the only operation you're allowed to do is either subtract or add a prime number of A, and in order for the operation to be valid, the result will also be prime. So you could either add a prime value of A and reach another prime value, or subtract prime value of A and reach another prime value. And you want to check whether it is possible to reach B from A, and if so, to print. You have to also check, you have to find the optimal path from A to B, and if there's more than one path, you have to print something else. Okay? This might look at a hard problem at first because A and B could be really large, 10 to the 15th power. But it turns out that our path cannot pass through many different numbers. In fact, the only candidates for intermediate versions that we have to consider are, well, 2, just natural prime number because the only even prime number we have. A minus 2, A plus 2, B minus 2, B equals 2. Okay. So why is this the case? Well, first thing to notice is that you can't start from A. Suppose that A is a prime different from 2. 2 is a special case. So suppose this A is a prime number that is different from 2. Different than 2. So A is odd, right? So if you add or subtract any prime number such that the result is not 2, the result will be odd, the result will be even and not 2, so it will not be prime, right? So for any prime number, you could only go to P plus 2 or P minus 2 as long as P is not 2. Right? Any other number, either you will go to 2 or you will go to a number that is not prime. Okay? So from A, you can only reach A minus 2, A plus 2, and 2 at first. Now, you could think that from A plus 2, you could reach A plus 4. But actually, among any triples of numbers x plus 2, and x plus 4, one of them must be a multiple of 3, right? Because if this is 0 mod, if this is 1 mod 3, then this is 0 mod 3. If this is 2 mod 3, then this is 1 mod 3, this is 0 mod 3. The other case, x is 0 mod 3. So between any 3 consecutive even numbers, one of them must be a multiple of 3. So you can't keep adding 2 forever, because eventually you will reach a multiple of 3, which is not going to be right. Okay. So the only option for A is to either go to A plus 2, and from here you cannot go to A plus 4 because one of them will be able to go 3, or from A you go to 2. You could go backwards as well. Go to A minus 2, but from A minus 2 you can go to A minus 4. So we have to consider the case where when from A you can reach 2. From 2, stuff happens because 2 can reach a lot of different primes, right? And that could be a problem. But again, if from 2 you reach some prime PB, in between A and B or before it, whatever, the same argument applies. From this guy, you can only go to P plus 2 or P minus 2, and you can't go much further because of the same argument. One of them will be a multiple of 3. Right. So if P is neither of these numbers, then you cannot reach P. You cannot reach P from P without going to 2 again. Okay. So it is never optimal to reach some prime P from 2 if P doesn't belong to this set. So the only candidates for numbers that you have to go through are only these 7 numbers. So now that we reduce our search space, we can just run any shortest path algorithm. You choose your favorite shortest path algorithm, run from A and see if A can reach B, only by using this versus. And you can easily modify your shortest path algorithm to tell you in how many ways you can reach A from B, and one possible way to do so. Okay. So this should be enough to solve the problem. The tutorial for this problem also mentioned that there is only one optimal path from A to B, so you would never print, what was this print? For Benny. But it's just like it can be proved that. I don't know how to prove it. I just thought that was interesting. But you didn't have to know that, because you can just calculate the number of paths from A to B. Okay. Anyway, any questions? Alright, that's the problem F. Is E height. So you're a hiker, and there's a sequence of N mountains. And you're a hiker and you have a certain goal G, whatever. And whenever, so you start at a certain height, and once you hike through this mountain, your height increases or decreases by the value of A0. And your goal is to reach the height G. And basically, the problem asks what is the minimum number of, and you always way to hike the mountains in this order: 0, 1, 2, 0, 1, 2, until n-1, and then go back to 0. The problem asks the minimum number of mountains you have to hike through in order to reach the height G. And the thing in this problem is that once you hike through the mountain, you get tired. And when you get tired, you get like more pessimist and you decrease your goal. So after you hike the I mountain, your goal decreases by I. And the question is, how many mountains do I have to hike to reach my goal? Okay, this problem can be solved using binary search, but you have to be careful to search on the correct thing. You can't search on the number of mountains directly because the function f of I that tells you whether after you hike the ith mountain you'll be above or lower than your goal. This function is not necessarily modified. It's not necessarily complex. It might be true that at some point you pass your goal, and then you hike downwards and you go below your goal. So doing binary search on this function will go wrong. You will be doing it wrong. One way to solve this problem is to suppose that your hike ends in some mountain AI, and you binary search how long did it take for you to stop at AI from AI. Now this function has to be modified, right? Because your goal was somewhere around here, your starting height is somewhere around here. And what happens is that after you complete a cycle, your height will change. It will change always by a constant factor, because the sum of these heights is constant between each cycle. So your height could either go up like this, or downwards like this. Okay. But your tiredness always increases, right? And more than that, it decreases in a quadratic way, because the sum of the n first numbers is proportional to x squared. So your height, the graph of your goal, would actually look something like this. Right? And since this value of height can decrease, and the worst case that this height is decreasing by a lot, but it decreases in a linear way. So at some point, it is always, since this guy is decreasing in a quadratic way, eventually this guy will become below the graph of this guy. Right? Because this guy decreases faster than this guy, no matter what the value of delta h you're increasing here. Right? So now the f function that tells you whether a given point for a given point t in time, whether you're above or below your goal. Now this function is monotonic. It starts with 0 and eventually becomes 1. And after that it's always 1. So you could binary search on the value of t for each individual mountain. Okay. So once you find the optimal value for each mountain, you take the minimum value at that median. Okay. Another way to solve this problem, which is basically the same thing, is not to binary search do a binary search for every mountain, but you do a binary search on the number of cycles needed to reach your goal. So you assume that the first time you reach your goal, you used q cycles. So it must be true that on the q plus 1 cycle, you will also at some point be above your goal, right? Because of this same argument. For some AI, in the q cycle, your height was above the goal. So in the next cycle, it must also be above this goal. So you can also binary search on the number of cycles, and once you find the correct number of cycles, you can check what was the first amount that in which you got above your goal. Okay? Yes.
I tried to do this approach by searching on the number of cycles, and it didn't work because of the case like 111, 5,000 minus 5,000, 1111. Like there's some point in the past that you've already reached the goal, but your cycle, since the sum is like 2, some of them there already, your binary search on the cycles, number of cycles will go like 2.
Yeah. In order to test whether a number of cycles is good or not, you have to simulate the process for every mountain. You have to calculate your height at every mountain in this cycle.
Okay, I thought you were talking about.
Yeah, you have to do that. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Otherwise, you'll be just calculating f for a single mountain and every mountain. Okay, so if you're binary searching a number of cycles, if you're testing a value q, you have to simulate the process of height for every mountain and check whether at some point you surpass your number mountain. And this will be one mountain. Okay? Yes.
Actually, I think this function is not monotonic. It's like the one subtraction between g and h. It's actually convex because in the beginning it made like the 1 and then the 0 and then the 1 again.
That is true. H could be somewhere.
Yeah, I think above g.
Yeah, that's a corner case. Actually, you have to be careful about that. But yeah, so you have to check whether the initial value of your function is already valid or not. That's a good point. This could happen. Or this.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this difference could start negative and then become positive. So you have to initially check whether the very first value of your sequence is a valid solution or not. This actually is more accurate. Okay, any other comments?
Ternary search works somewhat better for this problem.
What?
Ternary search.
Ternary search and what?
Because of the complexity of the.
You're ternary searching on this f function. Yeah, it could work as well. Yeah, but the binary search is slightly faster than ternary search. But yeah, ternary search still works. Any other comments? Okay. Let me see. Alright, that's a problem case. So basically, in this problem, you're asked in how many ways can you color a train consisting of n parts. So you have k available different colors, and you want to color each one of these positions with a certain color. Essentially, that the number of consecutive segments of plane D is a certain value t that is given to you. So you're given n, k, d, and t, and you have to count the number of coloring that satisfy this condition. Okay? So, yeah, we're going to solve this problem using dynamic intuitive because you kind of see some recursive structure in this problem, right? You can decide the color of one of the first position and then recursively solve for a smaller train somehow. This usually calls for a dynamic programming approach. So let's use as our escape the number, the length of the train that I'm trying to color right now, and the value of t that I'm trying to achieve. Okay. So suppose I'm trying to color a train of length m. I want to decide what is the color. Well, this guy has some color, right? This very first guy. So I'm going to decide how many positions will have the same color as this guy. And then I'll call recursively to the rest of the train. Okay. So for the very first guy, I initially have k minus 1 possibility of colors because I want this color to be different from the color of the rest, so the color of the following position here. So if I decide to paint these three guys the color, this guy has to have a color that's different from this one. So I have exactly k minus 1 choices for the color of this first segment. Okay? That is not totally true because if I decide to paint the whole train of the same color, then I have k choices instead of k minus 1. Okay, but let's not worry about that. So this is k minus 1 times. Okay, so I have to decide the length of this segment. If this length is less than d, then this segment will not contribute to the number of segments that has the length exactly d that have the same color. Right? So for So if I decide that this side has length, this segment has length L, and L is less than D, then the number of possible colorings is k minus 1 times this guy. Right? But I have to sum this over all possible values of L, which is for L equals 1 to D minus 1. Okay? Okay. But I could also pick the value of L that is D or greater. And in this case, the value of, I will start creating segments of length d that have the same color, so I have to subtract this t, right? I will call recursively to a smaller train, but also with a smaller value of t. And so again, I have k minus 1 possible colors for the very first segment. And if I decide to choose a side of a length that is greater than d, what you get is basically that from n minus L, t minus the number of such segments of length d that you just created, which is L minus d plus 1. Right? This is how this recursive function looks like. It's not exactly like this because we have a case where we can take the whole, we can paint the whole train the same color, so instead of k minus 1, it will be k. But this is easy to fix. It's just one extra if somewhere in your code. Okay. But the difficulty here is how to calculate this efficiently, because right now the current complexity of our code is we have n times t states, and each state is calculated in n time. Right? So this is actually n squared times t, which is too large. So we need to do better. And one way to optimize dynamic programming recursions that has this kind of structure where you have to add the value of the function in a consecutive row, consecutive column, or consecutive diagonal. In this case, a common technique is to also calculate what is the accumulated value of f over a row, column, or diagonal. So, excuse me. So just calculating the value of f, we calculate some f2 of nt, which is equal to the sum of f over a row. Okay. And we do the same thing for diagonals. So notice here that if I increase the value of L, the value of this argument reduces by 1, and the same for this guy. So this is actually adding a diagonal of the values of L. Right? So we're also going to store some F3 and P is equal to sum E equals 0 to the minimum value of nt of f n minus I t minus I. Okay. And you can calculate these values in the same time you calculate f. Once you calculate a certain f, you can do this iteratively, for example. And once you find a value of f, you update the value of f2 and f3, for example. F2 would be f2 of nt would be f of nt plus f2 of n minus 1t. Right. This recursion is true. And assuming you calculate the value of f in increasing order of nt, once you calculate f of nt, you already have this value calculated. So this value can be calculated in constant time. Same thing for diagonals. Okay. So if you can do this, you can calculate this values of f in an iterative way, and you can calculate all values of f, f2, and f3, in constant time basically. Because this is just the difference of two f2s, and this is the difference of two f3s. So now all f's can be calculated in constant time, and your overall complexity reduces from this to just n times t. Okay. If you hate interactive dynamic programming, you can do this in a recursive way, but then you have to calculate the values of f2 and f3 using also dynamic programming. So you have to memorize which values of f2 you have already calculated, and if you need a value of f2 that is not calculated yet, you calculate it using this recursion. This is also slightly more complicated, but if you really, really hate interactive DP, then this is one possible solution. Alright. Does anyone have any other solution that want to share with us? You really don't want to?
No, if my solution is quite different, but you can ask me later. Or
Fair enough. Okay. Moving on. Okay, problems are starting to get difficult. Let's do problem D. So D had a fairly simple statement. Had an array of integers, and you were given 4 indices: I, J, Actually, it's L1, R1, L2, and R2. R1, R1, L2, R2. And we're asked to count how many pairs ij are there such that I is between L1 and R1, J is between L2 and R2, and the values at these indices are the same. So B of I, B of J. There might be some fancy expression that solves this. I'm going to, I think there are many different solutions to this problem. I'm going to present one of them. Okay. So it uses a technique called square root decomposition. Okay. So if we calculate this, if you count the number of pairs in a naive way, it will take quadratic time to answer each query. In the first case, you fix one I, iterate J through L1 through L2 to R2, and count the number of occurrences of VI equals Vj. Right. One smarter way would be to calculate this value in linear time. Like first, pre-processing this interval, and you calculate an array of frequencies that tells you for each value how many times it appears in this interval. This can be done in linear time, and then to count the number of such pairs, you just iterate through this other segment, and whenever you find a value A, then the number of pairs that this guy forms with this interval is simply f of A. Right? So A is actually counting the number of times A appears in this interval. So this leaves a linear time way to answer queries. But of course, queries could be very large, and you have a large number of queries, so this alone is not enough to solve the problem. Okay. So we have to find a different way. So let's pre-compute a bunch of stuff. What we're going to pre-compute is, okay, first let me show something. If we have a query L1, R1, L2, R2, we can always decompose this query into other queries such that L1 and R1 is fixed to be 1. Yeah. So this is easier to see if we draw this on a 2D model. Suppose we have a query here. L1, R1, L2, R2. Now, the answer to this query is basically the answer to the query 1, 1, R1, 1R2. It corresponds to this whole rectangle. But I'm counting some pairs for I'm counting some pairs that I don't want, right? I'm counting pairs that are in this range and in this range. Right? So I'm going to subtract. I'm going to subtract. So this would be 1 L1 minus 1, 1 R1, which corresponds to this, which corresponds to this rectangle. Subtract this rectangle. 1 R1 1 all 2 minus 1. Which corresponds to this rectangle. But now I subtracted this region twice, so you have to add it back. It will be 1. L minus 1, 1, L 2 minus 1. Right? So each query can be decomposed in queries such that the L of both interval is 1. Okay. And now I want to find an easy and fast way to calculate each of this kind of queries. Okay. Now we're going to pre-compute the loss. Basically, now I want to answer queries of the form R1, R2, right, which is the right endpoints of both intervals. Okay. I'm going to pre-compute some values of this matrix. Okay. In particular, I'm going to pre-compute the values of all pairs R1, R2, such that R1 is a multiple of the square root of n, which is the length of this array. Okay? Because of reasons. You will see that. So for every R1 that's a multiple of square root of n, I will calculate the value of R1 with all R2s. And you can do this basically in the same way with it to solve a single query. So you first iterate through all multiples from 0 to n. And this one now. 30 multiples of square root. You have root of n, 2 root of n, 3 root of n, and so on. So I'm going to compute the value of all q's in this line, all q's of this line, and so on. Right? How do we do this? For these guys, I'm going to store the frequency array for this preference of my array. So if I'm calculating answers for root of n and some r, I will have in my frequency array how many times each value appears in the first root of n element. Okay? And once I know this, I can calculate the value for every r at constant time. Right? The value for 1 r is simply the value for the previous r plus the number of times this element appears in this frequency array. Okay? So every such value can be calculated in constant time, and how many guys do we have? We have each of these rows calculating n, but we're only calculating multiple of root of n, right? And I can get most root of n such as. So the overall time it takes to compute this guy is n times root of n, right? We have root of n such rows, and each row is calculated on linear time. Okay? Cool. And now I'm going to use this value that I just recalculated to answer each of these queries. To calculate in random arbitrary R1, R2. Okay. So, okay, not gonna cheat and use that diagram. So suppose you have some R1, R2 somewhere. And I want to calculate the value for this query using only, well, using as helpers values of q's that I already can calculate. Okay. So I'm going to find what is the largest multiple of root of n that is less than R2 and less than R1. So it should be somewhere around here. Have some k times root of n. And somewhere around here, have some L times root of n. Now, using only the values that I pre-computed, I can find the answer for this region formed by these three rectangles. It's basically the value for this rectangle, which I already have because this guy is equal to n. This rectangle, because this length is equal to n. And I subtract this region. And certainly cap is because both are multiple of root of n. Okay. So the value for this region, except for this part, I can calculate this in constant time. Right? The problem is this small area, right? But the length of this thing must be less than root of n, right? Otherwise, there would be some other multiple of n larger than this guy. Same goes for this guy. So how do we calculate the answer for this region? You do it in linear time, using the same algorithm I showed at the beginning of the explanation. Right? You just calculate the frequency value for this dimension, and then just run linear here, keep adding values. Okay. So for this three region, you can calculate in constant time. For this small region, you can calculate it in root of n time. So each query of this kind can be calculated in root of n time. Okay. So each original query can be also calculated in root of n time because this query is basically 4 queries of this kind. Right? So we can also answer each query of root of n time. So our overall complexity is n plus q root of n. And remember, root of n is magic because it is the value that basically minimizes if a times b, and it minimizes this function. Root of n is the value that minimizes this function. Max and over x. Because I get this value when I decide if I choose an arbitrary value for these multiples, say L, then I will get L here. Each query could be answered in all of L time. But if the computation would take n over L times L, right? Because I would have n over L things rows to calculate. So if I increase one, I make the other one worse. So we want to make these things balanced to improve our complexity. So the value that optimizes this is the square root of n. And that's why this technique is called square root decomposition. Okay, because the value square root of n is natural. Was that clear?
For this problem, if the constraints are so much larger, we will resort to some other thing of reprocessing, for example, logarithm translator.
You mean
The answer in square of the logarithm.
You mean if the values of the array were larger?
Was larger
And
under the same time constraints instead of square root the composition would resort to some other form to answer the queries in the square of the logarithm.
square of the logarithm.
Log power of 2.
This?
No. Square log power of 2. This.
2 log, yeah. Log ao quadrado.
This. I don't know how to solve this problem with cloud square. Is there a solution using cloud square? I didn't look into it. It doesn't, just because that, no, it doesn't, that there's no solution. So I'm curious, did you solve this problem in this complexity?
Or even logarithm time, even if the same approach would be used, where we search the answer in the vertical line in logarithm time, and the horizontal line in logarithm time, so would not be logarithm power of 2 of the logarithm would be logarithm time. But we would reduce it if the constraints very larger, maybe.
I'm not sure if this solution will work with the constant grid market. We'll have to think about something else. I'm not sure.
I think it's fair to note that we have another very different solution for this problem too, so if anyone is interested.
But does it run in
No, it's weird. I don't even know the running time. Arthur knows the running time, so.
Running time is a civic.
4 problems left to go. Yeah, I think we're running out a bit of time. We can discuss all this other cool solutions to this problem later, but I think it's better to try to just keep moving on. Otherwise, we're running out of time. You guys want a really quick break?
Yeah.
Like 10, 15 minutes max.
bicho humano ofensivo? Tipo, capivara é dragão agora?
Pior que não, tipo, se você tá meio vocês podem direito já tem que matar.
É? Tenta te o quê? Te matar? Os capivaras da USP são bem mais de boa.
Aqui quando ele tá pensando
Ah,
aí tá só preocupado com qualquer jeito.
Alright,
Que
let's
brisa.
continue. Have four problems to go, and those are the four most difficult problems of the sentence. So I'm gonna take some time, I'm gonna stutter, I'm gonna have to think about solutions. It's not gonna be very. Well, I'll do problem J now. That was easy and good three. So this was a slight generalization of a very well-known problem. I'm going to solve an easier version of this problem first. Instead of a three-scoop having an array, and you are giving several queries of the form R, and I want to know whether, in this interval from L R, what is the maximum, what is the contiguous subsequence of maximum sum? Okay. It is pretty much the same problem, the same original problem, but in an array instead of a tree. Right? The solution for this uses a second tree, ordinate tree, whatever. So what you're going to do is calculate, do the tree. And calculate for each node 4 different values. Calculate 4 different values for each node. You calculate the sum of the elements in this interval. You calculate what is the optimal solution considering only this interval. And you also calculate the prefix of maximum sum and the suffix of maximum sum. Okay. You calculate these 4 values for each node in this second tree, and now you can answer each query in a lot of time. Well, and basically what you have to do to answer the query in a lot of time is to know how to merge 2 nodes. So you have information for one half of your interval, you have information about the other half of your interval, and you want to figure out what is the information regarding the whole interval. Well, for this guy, the sum is clearly the sum of these 2 guys, so this is easy. The optimal solution is, well, we have 3 different cases for the best solution. Either the optimal interval lies entirely within this or this interval, in which case you can just take the maximum value of the best value of these 2 nodes. Or the best interval starts in this interval and ends in this one. In which case the optimal interval uses a suffix of the left node and a prefix of the right node. So in order to find what is the best interval in this form, you just take the sum of this guy and the pref of this guy. Okay, and you take the maximum of all these values. For pref, we have similar cases. Either the best prefix is entirely contained in this node, in which case the value would be the pref of this node, or the prefix contains this whole left node and ends in this right node, in which case the value would be the sum of this guy plus the optimal prefix of this guy. And you can calculate the suffix in the same way. So by doing this, you can calculate these 4 values for all of the second tree, and also answer each query and use the same idea. Is that clear? This is one sub-problem that I'm going to use this to solve the ordinary problem. Okay. So the idea is to reduce the problem on a tree to a problem in an array. So suppose now we have a tree. I have values on each node, and I want to solve the exact same problem. Given two nodes U and V, I want to know what is the subpath of maximum sum containing the path between U and V. Right? And the key idea here is to split this query into two parts. So I'm going to find the optimal answer from U to the lowest common ancestor of U and V, and the optimal answer from V to this child of the L state. Okay. And now what I need to do is, if I have the answer, if I have all the, okay, let me explain the solution to a problem first. So how do I calculate the solutions to queries of this form, where the path forms a chain of ancestors from U to subpath? What we can do is build the same segment tree we use for the array solution, but on this path from the root to this guy. Particularly, if I build a segment tree, a good segment tree from the root to every leaf in this graph, then I will be able to solve the problem for this path in the segment tree of any of these leaves. Right? So that's the same problem. Okay, so we have two problems here. First, I need to find the segment tree of all these leaves, and this might occupy total space. And second, how do I merge these two solutions? So let me solve the second problem first. So if we're using our segment tree solution, I know how to calculate not only the solution for this path, but also the values of sum, pref, sub, and rest, right? Same goes for this path. And you can easily find the answer for this whole path by merging these two values in phi for U and for V. Right? Because this is like an interval in your segment tree, there's another interval in your segment tree, and they're like continuous. And basically, what you're trying to do is find the answer for these two intervals at the same time. So the same logic applies. You can use the values of pref, sub, and best for these two guys to find the answer for the whole path. Alright. What remains is how do we find segment trees of all these? There are two different approaches. You could either cheat or do it in a complicated way. The complicated way would be to use persistent segment trees. Okay. And it would work as follows. You create the segment tree for this whole path. From the root to this first loop. And then to calculate the segment tree for this leaf, what you can do is basically remove this guy from our segment tree and add this guy. Right? To remove a guy, you can just set its value to -, something like that. Okay. And updating, and well, every time you update a segment tree, you can't keep track of all versions of segment tree using only log time per update query, just like we saw last week. Right? So from the segment tree of this guy, you could find segment tree of this guy using 2 times log memory from this guy to this guy. 2 times log extra memory. Right? And in order to find segment tree for this leaf, you can just remove these 3 guys from the segment tree and add this guy. And keep doing this until you find segment tree for every node. And you would only use extra n times log and memory. This would be the most natural way, I think. But you could avoid using a persistent segment tree by cheating. And by cheating, I mean you can pre-process every query. And for each query, you decompose them into two parts like this, and you somehow store this information. So if I have to calculate the solution from U to some ancestor of U, I store this information in this node. I have to calculate the answer from U to W. And I do this for every query before answering any of them. And now what I can do is use the same idea we used to build a segment tree for every leaf, but now I don't need to keep, sorry about that, I don't need to keep each previous version of the segment tree. Whenever I have the segment tree for some leaf, I can answer the queries for nodes in this path, then I can move on, and I don't have to worry about this old version of the segment tree anymore, because I won't use it. Right? If I read all queries beforehand, I can answer the queries in parallel with building the segment tree. So once I build segment tree for a leaf, I answer all queries that can be answered in this segment tree. Then I can move forward without having to remember what was the state of the segment tree in the past. Okay. So using this, you could avoid kind of implement persistency in your segment tree. So this makes the code a lot easier. But the solution becomes offline. Right? You cannot read a query and answer it immediately. You have to pre-process all queries, and then you have to answer them in some different order. And this is why it's cheap. Was that good? Now things start getting hard. Okay, I'll explain problem A now. Yet another problem with strings. So this also has a kind of small statement. So usually you have a set of strings. S1, S2, SK. And at any time, I have to do two kinds of operations. The first operation is to append character to one of these strings. Okay, this was cat. I could add an extra A to this word, it becomes CATA. The other operation is I have to answer given a string T whether one of these strings of this set is contained in this T. Or in other words, whether one of these words is a substring of the given string T. Right. Okay, how do we solve this? So the problem statement guarantees that the sum of the initial lengths all s is less than 200,000, I believe. And also there will be at most 200,000 queries. So the total number, the total value, the total sum of the length of your strings never exceeds 4 times 10 to the 400,000. So by the argument that I explained yesterday, there can be at most square root of this number different lengths of strings at any time. Right? Because the sum of the lengths must be this, then you can't be the case that I have one string of length 0, one string of length 1, 2, all the way to one string of length 2 with n, for instance. Because this would add up to more than n. So we have most for this different lengths at all times, which is approximately something. Does anyone know what is 400,000? It's clearly 600 and it's less than 640, and I calculated this by head, of course. It's quite easy. So this is a kind of small number. So one thing we could do is try to use this fact to solve the problem. So one solution would be to, at all times, for each length of string, we store the hashes of the strings that have this length. Okay, so for strings of length 2 or 4, whatever, I would have an array or a set. Set 4, which will contain the hashes of all strings of length 4. That's 4. It will maintain one set for each different length. And we know that we will have at most 640 different sets at any moment of my program. Right? Okay. And now how do I answer a query of this type? So given a string t, what you can check is for every length, for every different length that you have, you calculate, let's say, these A, B, C, D, A, F, G, whatever. So let's suppose I'm trying to see if there is some string of length 4 that is a substring of T and belongs to my current set. So what I can do is calculate the hash of every string of length 4. I calculate the hash of this guy, check if it belongs to S4. If it does, then this means that there is a string in this set that is equal to this prefix. So the answer would be yes. Otherwise, you move on to the next character, next substring, and this transition can be done constant time if you use rolling hash. So you move on to the next substring, do the same check, and basically you can verify for each length whether there is a substring of this length that is contained in our set in linear time. Actually, linear times 1. You have to binary search which should be set here. But for each length, I can verify whether there's a substring of this length and n times log of the number of elements here. Time. Right? But I have to do this for every such length. But we know that the number of lengths at both is 640. So the overall complexity would be root of, let me say 740, whatever. This is square root of the number of, the total number. It will be the number of different lengths I have in time. It's not really easy, but. Okay. And since the sum of the values of all of the lengths of all t does not exceed 200,000, also we think. Yeah. The sum of the lengths of all t does not exceed 200,000, so the overall complexity would be less than 200,000 times log n times 640. And this was quite large, but the timings were kind of loose. So this was enough to get accepted to this problem. So it would be a total length times log n times square root of there is one much harder solution that solves this problem in a more optimal way. Can solve this problem actually in Q log squared of the total length. Log squared of something, doesn't really matter. It is quite complicated, so I'm just going to give you a brief idea of how it works, in case you're interested. So the main idea is to use a try to store all the strings in my set. So yeah, try. And each leaf corresponds, not sort of leaf, but this try corresponds to all strings in my active set. Okay. And I'm going to count for each node in this try how many prefixes, how many strings S does it contain as a prefix. I should give a concrete example. C, T, I know that there is a string in my set that ends here, here, and here. Okay. So I'm going to propagate this information to the remaining vertices in corresponding substrings, so that in each node I know exactly the number of strings in my set that are prefixes of the corresponding string, of the string corresponding to this node in the try. Okay. Now, if I have a string T, how do I answer this query? This query of whether T contains a substring somewhere from this set. We can try every possible suffix of T. We can, for each suffix TS, you walk down the try following the character of TS. And if you reach a node that has a value greater than 0, which first, that would mean that there is some prefix, there is some prefix of this string that is a string of S. So this would mean that TS contains a prefix that belongs to S, so S would be a substring of T. Right? But this will take linear time for all TS, and since we have T such TSs, it will take quadratic time in the length of T. But we can do better. Instead of walking down the try path node by node, what we can actually do is binary search somehow on the node of the try. So suppose TS has some number of characters. What you can do is check whether this whole prefix belongs to the try. And it is clear that if you have a node, and if you add a node, and the next character of TS doesn't belong to the try, and haven't reached any node with value greater than 0, then there is no prefix, there is no string as that contains. TS doesn't contain any string of our set as a substring. So what you can do is first binary search to find what is the last character of your substring, of your suffix, that is contained in the try. And then you check whether the value of this greater than 0 or not. The problem is binary search. How do binary search on a try? And the key here is to use hash. So for each node in the try, calculate the hash of the prefix it corresponds. Okay. And now you can map each hash to a node in the try. And now, in order to check whether a given prefix belongs to the try, calculate the hash of this prefix and check whether it belongs to this set of hashes in the try. Okay, so now you can binary search and check whether a given suffix contains a prefix that is over of S. So this will take a long time per suffix. T has T suffixes, so this will take T log. Yeah, time. Okay. The problem is that I can modify my try, right? I can append characters to this word, and this will change the value of the try. Now, the idea here is, well, once you add a character to the end of a string, what happens is that this node initially corresponding to the end of the string, so that it had value 1 or greater than 1. And once you append the character, this guy doesn't contain this as a prefix anymore. So this value will decrease by 1, right? And this value that is the node we just added will be decreased by 1. So other nodes to the top of the try wouldn't change. What will change is this whole subtree. Okay. We can use a smart lazy propagation here to prevent updating the whole subtree all the time. Yeah, I told you it would be very complicated. But the thing is that you can't use pure lazy propagation here, because at all times, I need to check whether, given a hash, this hash can lie anywhere in the try, and once I'm analyzing the node, I didn't necessarily have to have passed the right ancestor, so the natural lazy propagation used for segment tree doesn't work, right? Because in order to reach this guy, I don't necessarily have to reach all of the ancestors, so there is no way I can update this guy properly. And now the final key observation to make this work is to see that the only time you need to update a node is when the value of this node becomes 0. It was greater than 0 before, and it becomes 0. Because if it is greater than 0, and after you make this modification, it can continue greater than 0, then it would make a difference for the binary search, because we only check whether the value is greater than 0 or not. But once it becomes 0, you have to update these nodes. And you can check whether that becomes 0, because that only happens if the string you added here for the previous node was exactly 1. But now it will become 0, and this whole subtree will have to be updated. Right? So then, one node can change from 1 to 0 exactly once in the whole execution of the program, because our strings are always increasing. So there's no way a node that becomes 0 can become 1 again, because I cannot insert a new string here that comes before this guy. So this gives us a final solution. I don't need to update this guy every time. I don't have to update guy that becomes 0, and that can only happen once in the whole execution of the program. So the amortized time to update all nodes is linear, the number of nodes in the try. So the overall complexity of the append query is constant, and for the contains query, it is log squared, because it's binary search the length of the prefix, and in order to check whether the prefix is present or not, you have to binary search this corresponding set of hashes. So the complexity becomes q times log squared. Is that clear? Probably not. Yeah, that's the very superficial idea of how to solve this problem in the log square time. And the code is much more complicated than the n log n square root of n code. And it was really painful to make my code work for this complexity. Just curiosity, because this problem is really similar to the data space you have to build is very similar to the thing that our algorithm is, right? The only difference is that you can modify the traits in your data structure. So I guess it would be nice to show how to do this in log time, as long as the string 0 set doesn't include the only increase. All right, I think we have 2 more problems to go. They're the hardest problems in this set. Let's do problem G first. LCM error. And I'm going to get confused so much with this explanation. Looks like. The signal is also quite simple. You're given a value x, an A and B. You need to count the number of non-decreasing sequences A1, A2, A10, and A10 was also given. Like that. Each of these guys lies between A and B. And the LCM of each of these guys is exactly x. Okay. How do you even start thinking about a solution of solving this problem? Oh, let's factor x, because when you have 2 numbers that are factored, calculating the LCM is easier. So basically, it's a good idea to do this problem. Let's both add this sum p1, alpha 1, p2, up to some pk alpha. Let's call qi as pi alpha. So the necessary condition for the LCM of all these guys to be equal to x is that for every I, someone in here has to be divisible by qi, right? Otherwise, the LCM will not be divisible by qi, it would not be equal to x. Right. So for every I, this must hold. There must be some guy in this sequence that is divisible by qi. Okay, so we need to count such sequences. Let's count the complement. So the complement would be the number of sequences such that for each I, there is no for some. This is complete. This must hold for all I. So the complement would be there must be some I such that no element here is divisible by qi. So I want to count the number of such sequences. The sequences A1, AN, such that for some I, qi doesn't divide any aj for all j. Okay, I'm calculating the complement, and then in order to find the answer, just subtract this value from the total number of such sequences. Okay. Yeah, I'm going to explain first how do we count the total number of such sequences, because it's going to be important in the solution. So knowing that you have to pick, you want to build a sequence such that each element lies between A and B. How many such sequences are there? And the sequence has to increase. Well, one way to look at this problem is, well, call x0 the number of times A appears in the sequence. And let the x1 the number of times that A plus 1 appears in the sequence, until x to some value, B minus A was or minus 1. Doesn't really matter. Okay. So basically the problem that I'm trying to solve is to count the number of solutions to the following way. x1 plus x minus 1 equals n. Right. I'm basically trying to pick for each element how many of these will show up in the sequence. Once this is decided, the order of them is also fixed because the sequence has to be increasing. And since this sum is n, I have picked n elements, so there is a bijection between the solution to this system and the sequence of n characteristics. And this is a very well-known combinatorial problem. Suppose we have, I don't think this is nice to do like that. But suppose we have n elements in this set, which is b minus a. So it's a known fact that the number of solutions to this system is m plus n minus 1, which is n. And to show this, there is another bijection you can do, which involves circles and bars. So each of this circle will be an element of the sequence that it will be picking. And the number of bars will indicate, will separate. Basically, how you interpret this is this is the number of guys that I'll pick for x0. I'll pick 2 guys for x0. I'll pick 1 guy for x1, 2 guys for x2, and so on. So the number of bars here is exactly n minus 1. And have to pick n guys who have n balls. And the number and there's a bijection between any permutation of circles and bars to one solution to this system. Right? And the number of permutation is exactly this. Right? It's n plus n minus 1 factorial over n factorial plus 1 n plus n minus 1 factorial, which is exactly this binomial. So this thing is going to show up a lot. So let's call it f of n, which means in how many ways can I take a sequence of n elements such that for each element I have n different options. All right, moving on. So I want to count the number of sequences that satisfy certain conditions, so we decided to count the complement. So the complement would be f of b minus a plus 1n minus something. Okay, I want to calculate this something. Okay. And this something is basically the number of sequences such that there exists some qi such that qi doesn't divide any element in my sequence. And I'm going to calculate the number of such sequences using the principle of inclusion and exclusion. So what we're going to do is fix some set of QIs, count the number of sequences such that no element in this sequence is divisible by any element of my set. And if I add and subtract all these guys, we have what I'm looking for. So in a more formal way, if we call Si to be the number of sequences such that Qi doesn't divide anyone in this sequence, then what I'm interested in is basically the cardinality of this set. Right? Let's count the number of sequences such that there exists some Si, some Q such that Q doesn't divide anyone. And by the inclusion-exclusion principle is equal to S1, Sk, minus the intersection 2 by 2. So you subtract intersection 2 by 2, add intersection 3 by 3, and so on. Now, calculating something like in this format is easier. So I have some set S1, S2, S, I'm running out of letters, L, whatever. So basically what this represents is the number of sequences such that Q1, Q2, and QL, none of them divide any element of my sequence. Right. So how many times does this happen? If I know how many elements between A and B are there such that this element is not divisible by any of these guys, that is, let's call this value, we can call Q, Y. So suppose Y is the number of elements between A and B that are not divisible by any element in this set. Like it's not divisible by Q1, Q2, or QL. Okay. Then the answer, then the cardinality of this set is exactly f of Y n, right? This counts exactly the number of ways I can take a sequence such that no element of this sequence is divisible by any element of this set of Q1, Q2, Ql. Okay, and we know how to calculate this guy. So we know how to calculate this guy. So we know how to calculate this guy. So finally, we know how to calculate the answer to our solution. Right? But you might be wondering whether this will be too slow. Because well, I'll admit something here, right? I still need to calculate y. I still don't know how to calculate y. So y, once again, is the number of elements between A and B that are not divisible by Q1, Q2, QL. You can again calculate y using the principle of inclusion-exclusion. Right? This is actually a more well-known problem. So you have a set of numbers Z1, Z2, Z, tell me, letter, C, whatever. And I'm going to count the number of elements in some interval such that this guy is right, such that this guy is right of the element. So once again, you can find the principle of including exclusion. So you count the number of elements in this set that are not divisible by Z1, then you add to this value the number of elements not divisible by Z2, all the way to ZC. But then you're double counting of the elements that are not divisible by either Z1 or Z2. So you subtract that, you subtract those, and you continue the inclusion exclusion, and you can calculate this way the number of elements in this interval that are not divisible by any element, by any of these elements. Sorry. So this time to list scary because you have one inclusion exclusion nested in another inclusion exclusion And inclusion and exclusion is exponential in the elements, so you might be really scared and say, oh, there's no way this is going to run under the time limit. But the thing is that you're doing some exponential stuff on some set of other stuff. Right? So for each subset of QIs, you're doing another inclusion exclusion of this subset, right? So this will be for each subset of Q1, Q something, okay. You'd be doing something like 2 to the cardinality of this set, right? And you wonder whether this value might get too large or not. But there's an easy way to show that this value is actually exactly 3 to the cardinality of this value. K cannot be too large because K is the number of different prime factors that X can have, and the product of the first 10 prime factors is already greater than 10 to the something, the sum power, 10 to the 9 power. So K is actually less than 10. So here's good, our total run on time. So we need to prove this equality. There's a very cute bijection between this and this. So consider a string of 0, 1, and 2s. Okay. So 0 will represent that I'm not considering this element for either S nor the subset of S. 1 means that I'm considering this element in S, but not in this subset of S, which would be disease. And 2 is I'm considering this element both in S and in Z. There. So there is this is a bijection between this string of numbers and any subset of Z paired with some subset of Q's, right? Because from this string, I can determine what was the subset S. It's just the element. The S would be all elements that are either 1 or 2. And the subset Z will be all elements that are 2. So there's a bijection, and the number of such strings is clearly 3 to the k power. So this equality holds. So this is a really neat bijection. Okay, I guess I covered everything, so you probably know how to calculate everything in order to solve this problem, and you don't have to worry about complexity, because complexity will be limited to 3 to k times k. Was that clear? Any questions? Final problem. Final problem, final explanation of the week. Again. And I have only 4 minutes this time. Precise problem. This is actually my favorite problem of the set. Because you read the statement and have no idea how to start. So you have some set of points. Each point has a certain value and some interestingness. I call it 5. And you want to choose a subset of these points that satisfies 2 properties. First, for a given value B, there must be, for excuse me. For the subset that you choose, there must be a way to choose a subset of the subset such that all values, all different sums from 1 up to n are achievable while using this subset that you chose. So if you choose 3 points, it must be able, just by using the value of these 3 points, to select some of them and get all possible values of some from 1 to b. And the second condition is that if there are multiple subsets that satisfy the condition, then you want to pick the one that has the lowest interest in x. And to make things worse, the problem also asks you to train such subset. So you couldn't get worse than this. Alright. So you really say you have no idea how to start, but then you look at the constraints of n, and you see this Q value 42. 42 is a really cool number, not because it is the answer for everything, but 42 is 2 times like 1, clearly. So once you look at this, some light must are inside your head. Because 21 is basically the maximum exponent that you can take to the power of, so that it doesn't become too large, right, to complexity-wise. So the constraints of n actually makes you start thinking in some kind of meet in the middle approach. So what does meet in the middle? How does meet in the middle work? We have some set of elements in our base points. What we're going to do is split this point into 2 sets. Some set A and some set B. We're going to compute some information regarding the set A, some potentially other information for set B, such that if I'm given one element from A and one element from B, I have enough information to check whether the union of these 2 guys is a potential solution to our problem. Okay? So we're going to do this, and we're going to split in a way that the first n over 2 points goes to set A, and the remaining n over 2 larger points go to set B. And I'm going to compute different stuff for these 2 subsets. Okay, since this holds the theorem of Markov, we know that each element here has 21 or less elements, so I can afford to run through every possible subset of this set and do some computation. And this is why we didn't make this goal. Alright, so for a given subset of the lowest n over 2 points, I'm going to calculate 2 things. First is the sum of interestingness of all points. Should be useful to try to break ties in case you have any solutions. And I also want to store. First thing is that I need to check whether using only these points, if it is possible to achieve all values between 1 and the sum of all points. Let's assume that sum of all points is less than b, otherwise we can just remove some point in our set. So if this doesn't hold, then there is no way this subset can be used to form a valid solution to our problem. Because all other points in B are larger than, okay, that's not clear. I have to show something first. Okay, so before we do that, let's first figure out how do we check whether all values between 1 and the sum of all points is whether all these values are covered or not by this subset. Actually, this is a problem that is actually harder just by itself. It has a greedy solution. So in order to check this, we first order all points by value, increasing order of value. And what I need to do is basically keep track of the sum of all points I have seen until now. So we'll take this as some 3. And now, suppose I'm looking at the next point of the sequence. If the value of this point is 5 or 4, this will mean that the value of 4 is not a tuple. Right? Because all other points are greater than 5. This point sums to 3, so there is no possible way to form 4 using all these points. Okay. Otherwise, this is for instance 4, then all values between 1 and the sum of these points is a tuple. Right? Because I can achieve all values using the sum of these 3 guys by invariant argument. When I get this point, I can use this point as a pivot and use this to build all values between 4 plus 1 up to 4 plus the sum of these values. So I just sort the coins and increase order value, keep doing this, and by the end of this computation, it never happens to be the case that a coin is greater than 1 plus the sum of the previous points, then I can achieve all different values from 1 to the sum of all points. Was that good? Okay. So now that we know this, we know how to solve this subproblem. Now I can argue why I said before is true. So if for some set A, there is some value here between 1 and the sum that is not covered by the set, then there is no way that this set can be optimal, can be used in a solution, because all other points in B are greater than the point in A. So even if you run the same algorithm with the points in A with the points in B, you will find the same problem. There will eventually find a point here that will be greater than the sum of the previous ones. The points of B will not help you because they're all greater than this point. So there will be still some guy here that is not covered and they do not satisfy the condition for the original problem. So among all subsets that belong to this A set, I will only consider those that satisfy this coverage condition. They must cover all elements between 1 and some of the other. So basically the mechanism that I'm going to sort of for each subset is whether if it satisfies the coverage condition, the sum of wi, and the sum of the n. Okay, now for set B. For set B, the restrictions are a bit used because if for some subset of points in B, if there is some gap that is not covered by the points of B, it might be the case that I could use some subset of A to cover this gap. Right? And this is not possible because the points of A are less than the points of B. So the points of A can actually cover gaps in B, right? The reverse is not true. So what I'm going to calculate for each B is actually what is the largest gap that these points leave when trying to cover the elements from 1 up to the sum of the elements of the values. Okay. Now for this subset, there might be some gaps here. But these gaps might be covered, and it might be the case that these gaps could be covered by subset A. So we can discard this subset. So I'm going to store what is the largest gap, G, I, whatever, that appears when you're looking at whether the values are covered or not. And also the sum of all interestingness. Is it all clear if you looked it out? Okay. So now, given one subset of A and one subset of B, how do I check whether this is a candidate for an answer? So the first condition, the first necessary condition is that the sum of points in A plus the sum of points in B must be greater than or equal to B, right? Otherwise, B will not be achievable even if you get all points. Okay. The second condition is there must not be any gaps here when covering the element from 1 to B. We know that A doesn't leave any gaps, but B could leave some gaps here. We have to check whether A is capable of covering all these gaps. And this is basically checking whether the sum of the i's for this set A is greater than or equal to this gap. Because if this is true, then if there is a gap here for set B, I just take this set that generates this value, and we use point A to fill this gap, so what this gap can be filled. Right? If that's not the case, if this gap is greater than the sum of the I, then it's clearly not, there's clearly no way to cover this gap using only points in A. Alright. So now we know whether A can cover the gaps of B. We can check whether the sum of A and B is greater than or equal to B. So this gives me enough permission to determine whether the union of A and B is a possible candidate for solution. Right? So once we know this, we can just, from all pairs, pick the one with the lowest sum of interestingness, and we will be done. The problem here is that there are 2 B21 guys here. There are potentially 2 21 guys here. And we can't do this in a quadratic way. That would be really stupid because it will result in the original complexity of 2 to the 4th, which is what you're trying to avoid. But we do have to do this. Basically, for each A, you find among the subsets present in B, which is the one whose gap is less than the sum of elements in A, and has the lowest sum of interestingness. And you can do this by sorting B by gap. You can also sort A by the sum of B, the sum of the i's, and you can basically find the optimal B for every A using like 2 pointers. Right? For each A, you have a pointer pointing to the first element in the array that has gap greater, less than the gap of less than the sum of value of the I. Once you move to the next A, this pointer can only move forward. This elements to the back has gaps of greater, actually less. So once you increase the sum of the i's, moving forward to the next possible subset of A, the sum of the i's increase. So the number of B's you can consider increases. So just moving forward to your pointer, you keep track of the subset here that has the lowest interestingness. And by doing this, you can find the best B for each A in number times constant time. So this will result in an overall complexity of 2 to another 2 times that, which is the amount you need to compute things. Is that clear enough? I really like this one because I honestly, when I first read it, I had no idea how to solve it. Cool, any comments? Yes.
Did you see if B is inside the gap?
B is inside the gap. Oh, this thing is B. Well, as long as the sum of VI for this set for the set of A and B is greater than B, then you don't have to worry about it.
But it
won't change the size of the gap.
Um,
The second.
Well, here I'm only considering a gap between 1 and the sum of the values of this subset. But it can also define gap as the largest gap between 1 and the minimum value of this guy and the value of b. This is actually a bit easier to implement because you don't have to check anymore whether these two guys sum to b. This is actually how I implemented it. So instead of calculating the largest gap between 1 and the sum of all values of this subset, you find a gap between 1 and the minimum of b and this guy, and then you don't have to check whether the sum of a and b is greater than b. Alright guys, hope you guys enjoyed the week. It was very tiring but also very fun to prepare all these lectures and conference for you guys. I think John has some words.
So I just wanted to say, firstly, I wanted to say thanks to everyone for all the A&M folks who came from Texas and welcoming us and being very friendly and taking us everywhere. It's been a great 2 weeks for us and we enjoyed it. So thank you for that. We really liked it. The other thing I was going to mention is if any of you have any interest in graduate school in Texas, come see me. I've actually got like cards or something. I can give them to you and you can email me and we can talk later or whatever. So again, thanks though. We've had a good time. Thanks for welcoming us here to Brazil.
Thank you all for you, and we hope to see you next year, next time.
Wait, this is for our lecture of second week.
Oh,